In February of 2021, a brutal winter storm swept through Texas. Every single raised bed in my garden was covered with frost cloth and encased in snow and ice. My collection of container citrus trees wisely opted to camp out in the living room, but there was one specimen that couldn't make it inside, and that was my Bloom Sweet grapefruit tree that's planted in the grounds. So how did things turn out? In this citrus tree update, I'll address the ongoing winter weather challenges in my area, the steps and the missteps that I've taken as this tree has tried to recover, and how you might better protect your own citrus tree through winter weather. I'm Scott from New Garden Road, always out here to inform, inspire, and elevate you. Encouraging biodiversity and restoring habitat is my mission, one garden at a time. I want to begin by giving you a brief history of this citrus tree. It all started around 2012 when I planted it in the ground here in my Austin, Texas garden. I intentionally planted it on the southeast corner of my house in a nice cozy spot in the hopes of protecting it from the harshest of north winds throughout the winter. This specific variety is said to be hardy down to about 14 degrees. Citrus trees planted in the ground and established over the course of 5 seasons or more will have an increased cold tolerance, but I always recommend protecting your citrus tree from cold weather if possible. In February of 2021, this tree was approximately 15 feet tall after an abundant harvest season. This winter storm was nothing like anything that I've ever had to go through here in my Central Texas garden, and I had to make some tough choices. And when it came down to protecting this citrus tree, I only had enough resources to protect the graft point. If you want to know more about that, I have a detailed video on the approach and my process of how I went about that. You can check it out. I'll link that in the description. Protecting the graft point in this way is the bare minimum that you can do to protect your tree, and the hope is that you would preserve the fruiting portion of this tree and it would go on to regrow and produce in the future. In hindsight, I really wish that I would have been able to protect the entire canopy of this tree, but that was a tall order, and ultimately this tree lost its entire canopy. In the middle of 2021, I needed to take some action on this tree because it had started to regrow really vigorously, but it was really jumbled up on the interior of this tree, and I worried that there would be some issue that I would miss, whether it was insect or disease related, and it just had some structural damage that needed to be cleaned up. So I went in there and I trimmed it up really aggressively, and if you saw that video, maybe you were thinking that was a bit wild. If you haven't seen it, check it out. I'll drop a link below, but I knew what I was going for and why. It just ended up not working out, but for different reasons. In subsequent winters, thankfully we haven't had a repeat, but it has gotten really cold. And what happened was in early 2022, we had a 60 temperature drop. I remember distinctly at the end of December 2021, we were running about 80 degrees, and then on New Year's Day, it was in the low 20s. That is a really abrupt swing in temperatures and weather for any type of plant to incur. And again, I had chosen to simply protect the graft point of this tree. I think this was probably the biggest mistake. It wasn't that I didn't tint it for the initial winter storm or that I pruned it to a central leader. It was that I didn't protect it adequately in subsequent winters. This is when it was really vulnerable. It didn't have a whole lot of growth, and I think what was there was just really crucial. So at this point, the entire central leader was damaged, and I also had some additional damage to the rootstock. Now you think I would have learned my lesson at this point, but clearly I didn't, because by late 2022, we got really cold again. I didn't tint the tree, and there was some more damage. I think you get the picture now that it's just been a really rough comeback for this Bloom Sweet. But this tree lives. I have been really consistent in applying a liquid drench fertilizer on a weekly basis, combining the Rev humic acids with the Holy Mackerel fish fertilizer from Fox Farm, as well as the soluble seaweed from MaxiCrop. I like mixing those 3 ingredients up together in a watering can, and I'll give them to all my container grown citrus. Typically it's a couple of sips for the ones in containers, but for this Bloom Sweet, I was giving it 2 gallons of that mix per week. And that was a protocol that I followed from the beginning of March through the end of October. And in addition to that, I've been applying a granular slow release fertilizer. Now I've tried a few different formulas, essentially whatever I had on hand, but I chose a fertilizer higher in nitrogen. That's going to be represented by the first number in the NPK. Some of the numbers that I was looking at in my application were 824 or a 623. You'll find recommendations on those packages of fertilizer in terms of how much to apply based on the circumference of the base of the tree. I had to guess a little bit because it's a bit deceiving here, but it was probably in the order of 2 to 3 cups of fertilizer per application. And on top of that, I was religious about applying a foliar application of the soluble seaweed powder. Seaweed does a great job in helping plants to recover from stress, as well as being a preconditioning technique which makes the leaf surfaces tougher. As we've gone through another season of drought here in Central Texas, roughly once a month I'm trying to give them a slow soaking to a depth of about 5 inches, and that's about right. I've chosen not to do any significant pruning to this tree this season, but it is starting to get a little bit wild, and as I've looked at it recently, one of the things that has kept me from giving any kind of shaping was the presence of giant swallowtail butterfly caterpillars. Citrus trees are a great host plant for these beautiful butterflies, and the last thing that I want to do is harm any butterflies. Now, as I intend to tint this tree and protect it better through this coming winter, it may require that I give it a little bit of light pruning just so that it fits better within that structure. I also want to point out that I've left a couple of the rootstock suckers growing on this tree. Historically, I said these should be pruned out because essentially they're taking energy from that root system and they're diverting it from the fruiting portion of this tree. It's going into those suckers, which are not going to fruit for you. So why would you want them there growing? After a discussion with a couple of colleagues, I began to understand there could be a benefit as these root suckers begin to grow. They're bringing some vitality and healing into that area, and it does appear that it's produced some recovery in this area of the plant. But what I was advised to do was to cut that rootstock back to about 6 to 12 inches. That way it's still there leafing out, doing some work, bringing in some nutrients to that area, but it's not so tall that it's really hogging them away from the rest of the tree. So after all this, I developed a revised strategy as to how I intend to protect this tree going through the winter. But I will be tinting this tree here in order to protect the canopy, and I'll be doing that with some very simple elements, essentially some metal U-posts. I use the ones that are about 3 feet long. I'll drive them into the ground with a heavy hammer, usually about 10 to 12 inches, and then I'll take some 8-foot bamboo stakes and zip tie them to the inside of these U-posts, and that will create a really tall, sturdy structure. This is something that I've used in the garden to make trellises. It really holds up to the wind here in Central Texas, and from there I have a basic structure that I can drape some frost cloth over. I do recommend a heavyweight frost cloth, a 2.5 ounce material that can give you about 10 degrees of protection. Now, a tree of this size, it may require multiple pieces. You can overlap them, and you can use some spring clips in order to secure things. That will help to close up the gaps, and you can utilize those stakes as a good point of contact for those clips. Now, what does the tinting do exactly? Well, we're trapping solar radiation. Throughout the day, even on cold days, the soil, and specifically the moisture that is in the soil, is accumulating solar radiation, and overnight that heat, it escapes slowly. So when you tint your tree like this with some frost cloth, you're trapping the solar radiation that's accumulated in order to insulate your tree overnight. So in my research, I came across a couple of techniques that might be useful to you. Number one was, in an effort to maximize your solar radiation capture, you can pull back the mulch around the base of your tree, because it's the soil, or specifically the moisture in the soil, which is going to hold on to that solar radiation. So if you've got a thick layer of mulch there, it can be a good idea to pull it back so that the soil can get the sun on it and absorb more of that heat. The other approach that I saw was termed as banking, essentially utilizing mulch or soil. This is just going to form another insulating layer. It would be similar to me wrapping it with row cover like I've done in the past, but when combined with tinting, I think you've got a more double down approach here. Now, whether or not those two things will save your tree going through a winter storm, I don't know, but it's certainly worth a shot. And from my experience, we should do everything we can. Scotty B on the microphone. Got the citrus jams. Gonna jam with the citrus jams. Yeah, it's so loud. Jam in. Now check out more awesome gardening videos on my channel. Like this video and follow New Garden Road for weekly content. You can grow your own food. Keep it organic.